What do you do when you know you're approaching full capacity, but you can't turn off the tap? I mean, you could slow down the rate of flow, but things would overflow eventually. It would just take longer to get there. Because that's how I think about climate change. Every day we get closer to a 1.5 degrees Celsius, maybe even 2 degrees Celsius warmer world. And that's a world of more famines, of heat waves, of forest fires, and not to mention millions of more lives lost. But you probably knew this already. So what are we gonna do about it?
The market for carbon removal is expanding rapidly, and hundreds of millions are pouring in. Companies are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and now there's increased attention on how and where that CO2 is going to be stored.
Now, a new method of removing carbon dioxide from the air and storing it in the sea has been outlined by scientists.
If we could remove our emissions and put it away somewhere else, why don't we? Well, we actually can. It's perhaps why people are obsessed with the idea of carbon removal.
My name is Naeem Merchant. I'm the Executive Director of Carbon Removal Canada, and we're a new policy initiative focused on the rapid and responsible scale-up of carbon dioxide removal solutions in Canada. Carbon removal, as we define it at Carbon Removal Canada, is the process of removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it away for centuries or longer. Some people might quibble on how long we want to store away that carbon dioxide for. Some say it should be millennia or longer, and some say it doesn't really matter how long. In our view, we are dealing with a centuries-long problem, and so we want to store away the CO2 that we remove from the atmosphere for centuries or longer. That we're taking CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, and we have an excess of 2.5 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We need to clean up that mess of CO2 in the air, and that's what carbon removal is trying to do.
Perhaps our most ancient method of carbon removal is planting trees. But there's more beyond that, because planting trees alone won't remove all of the CO2 that we have in our atmosphere. For one, there's direct air capture, which is when chemicals bind with CO2 to then store deep underground. Or there's enhanced rock weathering, which crushes up rocks, places it over large swaths of land to increase uptake of CO2. Or there's biochar, which is when you convert plant biomass into a state that locks in the CO2 for a long period of time. And these are only a few examples of carbon removal that can take place.
All of these technologies are at different levels of technology readiness, and they present potential opportunities as well as risks, but we can't test that in a lab. We need to have proof of concept projects to ensure that that we are advancing projects and technologies that actually work. And it's really important that we start doing that work now in this formative decade for carbon removal to make sure that when we need to scale these carbon removal methods in the future, that we know we're scaling stuff that actually really works and is effective and is cost effective. So there's a lot of challenges that we need to figure out, and the challenge is that we haven't started to do that yet.
I feel like there's an interesting tension here that isn't unique to just carbon removal, but to all climate technology solutions. We have to scale up the technology of carbon removal, but we also have to scale up support for carbon removal in and of itself. So what does that look like?
Tendency to think that the solution to climate change is going to come with just this next technology, that the technology they're making needs to be broad, accessible, directly relevant to the experiences of everyday people, and affordable. And one way to guarantee doing that is actually centering workers and other precarious and marginalized peoples in the solutions, in the research being developed.
I spoke with Ishmael because, to be honest, carbon removal is abstract. You can't see CO2, you can't taste CO2, but you can feel CO2 in a sense. But some communities feel it more than others.
I distinctly remember at the height of the pandemic, one of these days, stepping outside, wearing a mask, wildfire smoke covering the entire city, And I was just thinking, this is absurd. This feels like apocalyptic conditions. And I remember getting to work, and on that very day, we had an outdoor barbecue where a chef was stationed. Again, despite it being a heat dome, despite inhaling wildfire smoke, he was on that grill for hours and hours until the heat got so bad he passed out. He got sent home. So that was a very stark example of how the climate crisis, whether that manifests as heat domes, wildfire smoke, was intruding on our work on a very concrete way and shape.
Ishmael's story isn't an isolated incident. His organization embarked on a whole campaign thinking about precarious workers in a changing climate.
I worked in a pizza place, I guess, during 2021's heat dome. You can imagine how hot it gets while working next to a pizza oven. That pizza oven went up to like 500°F, and working in like 35-degree weather in front of an oven that ran that hot was not ideal. I think that experience kind of solidified for me what it's going to look like in the future for people who look like me, who will have to work these jobs.
Think about the metaphor of water overflowing and the need for carbon removal. I think about communities like these, because it's not just people on the other side of the world who are suffering from rising sea levels. It's also right here in our backyards. Migrant workers who grow our food and service workers who serve us that are on the front lines of climate change. So when I think about carbon removal as a climate solution, it brings me to the question of when. When are we going to see the benefits of carbon removal? If we remove emissions now, are we going to see the effects now?
If you think about where the effect of carbon removal is really going to make an impact, it's in the latter half of this century, right? From a bigger picture, carbon removal can actually help us, as I mentioned before, draw down the legacy emissions that are going to be needed to address long-term climate change. So when we hit net zero, that doesn't mean the world is immediately going to cool down. That just means it's going to stop heating up. And so whatever the temperature we're at in 2050, when net zero we hit, if we're lucky enough to hit net zero by 2050, the reason we need to start now, and I think when we know that we have to remove billions of tons of CO2 globally every year by mid-century, according to UN climate experts, that means that the scale path is very, very steep. Right now, through the methods that I'm talking about, we are maybe removing tens of thousands of tons of CO2 every year. We need to get to billions of tons by mid-century. There's just no way we're going to be able to benefit from these technologies unless we start right away. We cannot just flip a switch and expect carbon removal to switch on and solve a big problem for us at the scale of billions of tons per year in 2049. We need to start building this now.
Carbon removal is a bit like planting a tree. We start up carbon removal now, and we see the benefits decades later. And in this sense, who exactly is planting the trees of carbon removal?
Hi, my name is Vivian Can. I am part of BDC Capital's Climate Tech Fund, and I support the commercialization and scale-up of Canadian climate tech. For BDC, our goals are clear. We want to help Canada reach its climate goals, and we want to help scale and grow high-potential Canadian companies into global climate technology champions. And we want to do our part to reinforce a strong climate tech ecosystem that will help accelerate and deploy Canada's innovations in climate technology.
I spoke with Vivian because BDC is invested in a company named Svante. Svante is primarily a carbon capture company, which is about 1 degree removed from carbon removal. Think of it this way: removal versus prevention. Carbon removal removes existing emissions from the atmosphere, while carbon capture prevents emissions from entering the atmosphere.
Svante at the time was well known in the Vancouver clean tech and climate technology space. They've been around for a few years doing some early development work in scaling and testing their carbon capture technology. When we met with them, we were very impressed with the team. They were able to show us they had the expertise, the vision, and the right technology approach to bringing down the cost of carbon capture and enabling meaningful kind of second generation adoption of carbon capture technologies.
Is cost a key component to investment in carbon capture? So, for example, you mentioned that bringing down costs of carbon capture is valuable. Why would you say that?
Cost is always one of the highest barriers to adoption of any technology. So when we're trying to scale industrial, capital-intensive type technologies, it's really important to find a pathway to make it cost-effective for the adopters.
And looking at Svante's solution of industrial carbon capture, why industrial carbon capture as a climate tech solution?
In 2021, 40% of Canada's emissions came from heavy industry, including oil and gas. So that's a big problem, and it's a problem we need to tackle now. We think industrial carbon capture is a critical tool amongst a toolkit of other solutions in decarbonizing Canada's industrial sectors.
Seeing that the industrial sector is in need of this technology, what would you say your outlook for adoption is of industrial carbon capture technology?
So Svante's technology is currently being deployed at 4 pilot plants in the cement and oil and gas sectors, and its technology is made for use in heavy emitting industries like steel and pulp and paper. We're also excited to see Svante's technology being applied in carbon removal applications like direct air capture.
BDC is one of many investors in Svante and is actually one of the smaller investors in the company. I only say this because Chevron, the fossil fuel company, led Svante's most recent fundraising round of $318 million.
What role do other strategic investors such as Chevron play alongside BDC?
Strategic investors, we believe, play a critical role in being early adopters to demonstrate Svante's technology in a commercial, real-life industrial setting.
There's perhaps no industry that faces more pressure to decarbonize than the oil and gas industry. But what does it mean to have the industry that caused the problem in the first place now invest in the beginnings of the solution? Chevron's investment in Svante is just one example in recent years. Occidental Petroleum, another fossil fuel company, purchased a carbon removal company for $1.1 billion. We as a public don't really get a say in investor decisions like these. We don't get to vote on what Chevron or BDC or Occidental Petroleum spends their money on. We just have to accept that what they're doing is the right investment decision. The question is, the right decision is according to what regard? Is it from the perspective of this carbon capture, this carbon removal company is going to make me as an investor the most money? Or is it from the perspective of this technology, this is what's going to get our planet to limit its warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or further? Or is it both? Or is it something else entirely?
But when you hear concerns such as that about discomfort that people are feeling because of certain segments of carbon removal's ties with the industry that is largely responsible for the climate crisis, how do you respond to that, and how should we navigate that?
People are right to be concerned and have questions about that. We just look at carbon removal as playing a very distinct role in addressing climate change. And it's important to be thinking about the role of carbon removal across the industry and not just with any one sector. I think we've seen some carbon removal methods like direct air capture attract some attention from the oil and gas industry because some of the infrastructure that's required to build out direct air capture requires the skills and expertise and other assets that extractive industries just know very well. And so it feels familiar in those respects. But I don't think that direct air capture or any carbon removal method is a reasonable pathway at major scale for decarbonizing oil and gas or any one of these major extractive industries. We really need to get emissions rapidly down across all industries, including the oil and gas sector, very quickly. Because for us, the main benefit of carbon removal is not to help any one industry find a way out of getting to net zero. The real job of carbon removal is to draw down historical emissions that have accumulated over decades and centuries.
Maybe if we take another look at an industry that's interested in decarbonizing, we'll find a clearer answer. At least that's what brought me to the mining industry.
I'm Greg Dipple. I'm head of science and a co-founder of ARCA Climate Technology. I'm a geologist and I've taught at the University of British Columbia for more than 30 years in earth science. And for about 20 of those years, we've been doing research on using mine waste to capture carbon dioxide from the air and store it durably in carbonate minerals. And that research naturally evolved to having a lot of collaborations with the mining industry and become larger in scale. And at some point, it just seemed to make a lot of sense to move out and try and do things commercially so that we could continue to expand the scale and start to actually remove tons of carbon dioxide.
ARCA is a carbon removal company, largely through the process of carbon mineralization.
Which is what we do, where we turn the carbon dioxide into a solid, thermodynamically stable state where it can persist over geologic time, so hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even millions of years. And to do that, you need a mineral feedstock. So if you're going to do that at the gigaton scale, you need to be moving and handling rock at the gigaton scale. And, you know, the mining industry is the industry that we have globally that does that. At ARCA, what we're trying to do is find ways to use waste streams from mining and some other types of industries, in particular alkaline industrial wastes, use them to capture carbon dioxide from the air and put it into minerals. So to do that, we optimize and work within the waste storage facilities so that they can increase the rate by which they capture CO2 from air. So a lot of these wastes are naturally reactive to CO2 in air, but at very low rates. By managing things like the water content, the surface area, and the alkalinity, we can enhance those rates of capture. And we do that through a technology we call smart churning. So we have autonomous rovers, roughly the size of a dune buggy, that deploy equipment across the landscape of the tailings storage facility, but autonomously so that it can be done in ways that you don't need people walking on the tailings. And that's coupled with continuous sensing of the rate of CO2 capture and some key metrics that govern the rate of capture so that we can use that monitoring data to guide where and how we deploy our rovers to manipulate the surface. So the difference between dumb churning and smart churning would be that dumb churning would just be drive continuously over the landscape, and smart churning is this idea that we use data collection and feedback to actually make active decisions on how to deploy our technology to sustain high rates of carbon capture. We have a second suite of technology that can kind of operate within the processing circuit to make the mine waste more reactive, and we call that activation. So we're trying to disrupt the mineral structure to make the metals, the magnesium and the calcium in that waste more reactive to CO2. So we can then take waste that may not be that reactive, activate it, and then once it's out in the waste facility, deploy smart churning and enhance the rates of capture.
The thing is, ARCA can't do this on just any mine. It takes quite a few steps to figure out if a mine is even appropriate for carbon mineralization to begin with.
So my name is Jennifer. I'm working as a lab technician at ARCA. I'm on the analytical services team. So these companies will send us samples and we'll do various tests to evaluate mineral content, geochemistry, as well as the CO2 potential capacity. So that's sort of what I do in the lab. Usually my day-to-day looks like coming into the lab, checking up on some of our flex experiments. So we're measuring the capacity of CO2 uptake of different samples that companies send us. And so I'll be checking on those experiments. So currently I have some samples out there drying, and what I'll be doing after they dry is crushing them up into powder form. And we're going to be submitting them to an XRD lab at UBC in order to sort of evaluate what's actually in those mine tailings and sort of go from there.
You know, we're approaching this as geologists. We kind of recognize that every site is different. You see that when people design mines. Each mining site have differences in their processing circuit and differences in their operation that reflect the local reality in terms of the mineralogy, the nature of the rock, the climate, a number of other things. Our technology needs to be the same way. We need to be adaptive to the geology and the differences on a site-by-site basis so we can find the opportunities. So, you know, we really do have sort of a portfolio of technologies that we can deploy, and we will deploy those in different ways depending on the nature of the site. So it's not a modular sort of cookie cutter approach. It's really important that we have this sort of the toolbox of approaches. Because most of these mining companies are really operating or thinking predominantly in sort of compliance markets and emissions reductions. So they are looking at, legal frameworks around their carbon emissions, and their goal is to reduce their corporate emissions and ultimately get to, net zero targets that many large companies have. The mining industry, reputationally, the worst industry in the world, maybe slightly better than oil and gas now, but mining is, traditionally thought of as, and for good reason, has been an incredibly destructive industry for the planet. But if we're going to transition our energy systems away from fossil fuels, and if we're going to achieve carbon dioxide removal, we need an industry like the mining industry that has those capacities. So this is a chance for the mining industry to step up and change what they do and how they're perceived.
There's an interesting case here where companies are operating not from a position of this is good for the planet or we can make money from this, but rather because they have to. Cap and trade is a type of regulation where industrial emitters like fossil fuel companies or mines actually have a cap at which they can emit CO2. They're only allowed to emit as much CO2 as they have credits for. So if they're under that cap, they can trade those excess credits. But if they're over that cap, they have to buy more credits to make up and meet that cap. The EU has actually had a system in place since 2006, and Brazil and Canada are looking at implementing one across their countries too.
So right now, companies in polluting industries are required to stay within certain limits of pollution, and where they go over those limits, they can buy credits, for example, to bring themselves under that cap. So there's an opportunity to use carbon removal credits, for example, to stay within those requirements as part of compliance regimes. So this is going to be something that I think is going to be an industry that is going to be quite heavily regulated and will benefit from policy support early on.
But governments need to be convinced that this is the right policy, and not all of them are. The US years ago tried and failed to implement a national cap and trade program, and it doesn't look like it's returning anytime soon.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what makes carbon removal pretty different from a lot of other climate technologies is that there isn't an economic or commercial or technological benefit delivered to some end user at the end of the day. We are removing CO2 from the atmosphere and we are storing it underground for long periods of time. And so the economic case can be difficult to make for carbon removal. I see it as a public good. Carbon removal is a public good. Just as we pay to remove pollution from our water that we drink, we're talking about removing pollution from the air that we breathe.
The good news is that there are industries that are stepping up, and that's beyond oil and gas and mining. It's beyond a regulatory or compliance basis. It's from a voluntary basis.
Canadian company Shopify has been at the front end of that. Microsoft, of course, has been leading at this for a while. Stripe is an early leader as well, and there's an alliance of buyers called Frontier. They're all, playing very important roles in putting into place, purchase agreements and even pre-purchase agreements that start off recognizing that it's really expensive to do durable storage at the beginning, but it will ultimately scale to be less expensive. But they need to be followed up by a bigger range of buyers to buy into this, with the cost continuing to decline over time down into the $100 or $200 range, which is sort of economically viable at scale. But those early leaders have played a huge role in helping companies get started, helping removal credits start to be generated.
Canada is really well suited to be a global leader in this space. When you look at the entire spectrum of carbon removal methods, you need a lot of land, you need coastline, you need abundance of clean energy, you need a skilled workforce, you need people who understand how to do carbon storage, you need a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship and foreign investment and domestic investment in clean energy infrastructure. Canada checks all of those boxes.
If you look at the range of technologies that we have out there, this idea of being able to remove billions of tons of CO2 per year from the air and store it durably just sounds mind-boggling. The reality is there's more than enough technologies out there to do it. It's technologically feasible. It's basically we have to agree to pay the cost of doing that. It's economically feasible, but there is an economic cost. There are technological improvements that are needed, but I think those challenges are much smaller than the challenges that we have around accepting that economic pathway, what that means in terms of transitioning our energy systems, and also the international and global cooperation it's going to require. So I think the technology story is a hopeful one. We can do this. We just have to choose to do it.
I've been thinking about a few questions. Who's going to benefit from the industry that is carbon removal? When are we going to see its positive impacts? And perhaps most importantly, are we going to be able to do it fast enough?